At the start of the year, I made a video on an absolutely insane supernatural found footage horror film called Devil's Pass, which twisted the true events of the Dyatlov Pass incident into what I can only describe as one of the most profoundly and jaw-droppingly far-fetched films I have ever watched. Yet, I noticed there were a few comments comparing it to another obscure 2010 horror film called Yellow Brick Road, which up to that point I'd only ever seen the poster for, and always just shrugged it off as probably some generic hunted while lost in the woods type film. Naturally, I was left curious. What could possibly be behind this vague poster to inspire comparisons to a film that takes the harrowing tragedy of people dying in hazardous conditions and morphs it into a creature feature about bizarre government experimental time-warping mutants? Maybe there is some tasty schlock in here. Maybe I shouldn't be so quick to judge a book by its cover. Maybe, oh my god, what if a film called Yellow Brick Road, a reference to The Wizard of Oz, actually had something to do with The Wizard of Oz? Now, before we dive any deeper, this video is sponsored by Raycon. Every year, March is the month of madness for me because I always have so many personal and professional commitments happening all at once, and it is just a constant stream of noise, so when I finally get some brief respite for myself, I only want to hear things that help me to relax and recover before the grind continues. As such, Raycon's everyday headphones help me to tune out the chaos and focus on what matters, whether it be playing video games, listening to music and podcasts, or watching films and YouTube videos. In particular, I love their hybrid active noise cancellation, which drowns out surrounding sounds so I can immerse myself in my own world, such as when sitting on the couch watching films on my tablet while my fiance uses the TV in the same room, or when I'm editing videos like this one, I can work without distraction. Their latest model is better than ever with a 40-hour battery life and comfortable ergonomic design for all-day wear, and with Raycon's quick charge function, just 15 minutes of charging yields 2 hours of battery life. Raycon's everyday headphones start at half the price of other premium audio brands with similar features, and with a 30-day happiness guarantee return policy, you have nothing to lose. Experience premium sound wherever you go. Head to buyraycon.com/Ryan25 to get 25% off Raycon's best-selling everyday headphones. Yeah, while it's not strictly speaking about The Wizard of Oz, Yellow Brick Road uses it as a literal in-world reference to set up its uniquely bizarre yet strangely compelling premise. In 1940, the entire population of Friar, New Hampshire decided to one day follow an unmarked trail into the northern wilderness for unknown reasons, only for a search party to later discover multiple bodies of missing townsfolk, some of which had frozen to death while others had been slaughtered, with the rest having simply disappeared. However, one sole survivor emerged, but during their police interview, they remained erratic and distressed, and soon erupted into psychotic behavior over painful, disturbing sounds that investigators couldn't hear for themselves. The film puts us into the present-day shoes of Teddy Barnes, as he collects the now declassified documents in the hopes of co-authoring a new book about the mysterious happenings with his wife Melissa. From the vague background it gives us, I got the subtle impression of a forlorn and troubled man, someone who seemed to be struggling to find success in his work, as implied by Melissa's concerns of dissatisfaction should the expedition ultimately go nowhere. In fact, Walter makes an accidentally snide remark that Teddy has transitioned into teaching because he couldn't do what he loved, hence the desire to throw everything into this one expedition. For the journey, they recruit a forestry expert called Cy, an intern called Jill, two sibling chartographers called Aaron and Daryl, and their psychologist third-wheeling best friend Walter. While the opening moments set an eerie tone with the grainy, morbid photographs and unresting quietness, the setup of the actual expedition is fairly muted and pedestrian. The characters are all pretty beige for the most part, and it lacks a certain visual punch to make it engaging, but once they begin their search for the trail only to immediately hit a dead end within the town, suddenly that severely downplayed atmosphere I initially viewed as a negative began to evoke a chilling sense of otherworldliness. Something just doesn't feel right. In fact, there's an acute uncanniness to its delivery. It's obviously made on a super low budget, which I assume explains its limited production value, but that lack of cinematic presence, let's call it, started to work for me, especially when events inevitably begin to escalate. The presumed coordinates of the trio, according to the documents, leads them to an empty movie theater, where Teddy and the crew are left deflated to discover it's all likely a non-starter. But after chatting with a theater employee called Liv, who desperately pleads to go on the journey, she offers to lead them to the beginning of the elusive road that the town seemingly tried to hide. While the current town remains hostile and evasive of the events, Liv explains that her grandfather was irregularly around during the events of 1940, and that the town was strangely fixated on the movies, particularly Wizard of Oz, which was seen as a much-needed escapism during the Great Depression and Second World War. Now, I'll probably lose some people, but here's the thing. Once you get past the surface of the concept, there's a surprising poignancy to how Wizard of Oz is used as a meta-reference to explain why the town wandered off into the wilderness to begin with. It's said the trail was nicknamed Yellow Brick Road because the people of Friar curiously believed it would lead to a god or wizard of sorts, and thus making it home to Emerald City is a neatly fitting, if far-fetched, allegory for people desperately seeking sanctuary in a time of great unrest, uncertainty, and wartime destruction. Admittedly, it took a bit of mental gymnastics to wrap my head around it at first, but as I was reflecting on what little information the film actually gives you, mixed with how surreal and dreamlike the journey increasingly becomes, I began to realize that the film is unapologetically Lovecraftian. On the surface, I do get the general comparison to Devil's Pass in how growingly absurd it becomes with its jarring implementation of Wizard of Oz, but Yellow Brick Road surprisingly makes a thoughtfully genuine thematic point with it, when you consider both Liv and Teddy's personal motivation for following the trail. To be honest, like Mothman Prophecies, I expected to come in and just have fun with this one. I had no expectation of going deep with it, but it will help to better contextualize the madness that transpires. As Liv explains to Teddy, she has no family or purpose at home, and seems obsessed with the idea of knowing if this road truly leads to the metaphorical haven of Emerald City, where she hopes answers may lie. She expresses she's tried to take the road before while drinking around the outskirts, as though to suggest she's troubled and in search of a solution to her profound sadness. In fact, she even later admits that her story about her grandfather was a lie, so she had an excuse to go on the trail and not be alone, loneliness of which revealing itself as a recurring sentiment amongst the rest of the party. However, where the Lovecraftianism truly clicked for me was late into the film, where Liv has an existential nihilistic rant about life being nothing more than birth, death, and the meaningless existence we have in between. She describes the trail as a way out, a light at the end of a dark, treacherous tunnel. There's a religious connotation on display, where it seemingly understands what people want, but whether it truly gives them what they want is the answer she sorely seeks. Teddy, on the other hand, is kind of in the same boat. He seems vacant and lost for most of the journey, and clearly lacks much of a plan or forethought into how this expedition might play out. It becomes apparent near the end that he's dissatisfied with his life, and his motive is likely pure selfishness. Perhaps this trail might give him the purpose he also seeks, hence his fixation on making it to the end regardless of what happens to his party, especially when ambiguously spiritual, supernatural, and nightmarish undertones begin to arise. The film establishes two curious elements. The first is that each day, Walter conducts psychological evaluations and begins noticing worrying signs of disorientation, memory loss, and sudden erratic behaviour amongst the group. There's an acute hostility that arises seemingly out of nowhere, as though the wilderness itself is having an hallucinatory effect on them, especially when the second curious element throws all expectations out the window. Not long into their journey, the group begin hearing invitingly quirky quirky 1940s music blaring in the distance with a strangely ethereal tone, which they come to assume might be the elusive Emerald City that the townsfolk originally hiked towards. Not only that, their GPS soon stops working, and the sibling chartographers are left baffled at how nonsensical their tracing coordinates have become, with the only coordinates that do seem to make sense are the ones leading further north towards the mysterious Emerald City music. Reflecting back on Liv's remarks about what the trio may mean, it basically started to insinuate to me that the group have been absorbed into some sort of purgatorial time vortex where the only direction they can go is towards the end of the trio. In fact, when they later try to turn around and head south when shit hits the fan, the music only grows harsher and more aggressive, as though forcing them to accept the one inescapable path forward, evoking the sense that an omnipotent Lovecraftian presence is pulling them towards it. However, before that revelation, the shit that hits the fan, so to speak, is when the siblings get into an argument over equipment, which causes Daryl to suddenly and barbarically tear his sister apart like an animal and bail deeper into the wilderness. By this point, the film was firmly playing into its uncanny valley avant-garde nature that it began reminding me of Antrim, the deadliest film ever made, which goes to reinforce that At the Mountains of Madness theme of the characters all going insane. It's also worth bearing in mind there's no monsters or spooky sightings throughout the entire journey. It really leans into its vagueness, even subtly throwing in details like one or two of them potentially eating poison berries when their food rations dry up, suggesting it could all be in their head. Anyway, Teddy and Cy track down and subdue Daryl, who has their coordinates to get back home, but he only ends up escaping during their painful efforts to turn back, which properly leans on the Wizard of Oz theme when they also see Erin's mangled corpse posed like a scarecrow. Undeterred, Cy decides to soldier on by force, even taking Liv with him, only for them to grow closer before Cy admits he shares the same homicidal urges as Daryl, and eventually requests that Liv restrain him and snap his neck, not only to protect her, but to also do it out of mercy? At this point, it gets very convoluted, but my theory going forward was that only those with the strongest willpower will reach Emerald City, while the others are doomed to the purgatory of the wilderness to succumb to an inconsequential mere mortal demise. After Teddy abandons the rest of the group in search of the end of the trio, Walter and Melissa soon leave Jill behind after she eats their remaining food, leading her to depressively walk off a cliff. Walter soon confesses his romantic interest in Melissa and admits he was never able to move past it, hence his third wheel in closeness with Teddy and Melissa as though trying to stave off loneliness. And the next morning, Melissa finds Walter has offed himself. In the vein of Lovecraft, the point seems to be that these characters die when they stop following the road, or metaphorically speaking, when they fall back into their old ways or weaknesses. Melissa is then unceremoniously murdered by Daryl, who's been hiding in some random cave this entire time, only for him to be then hunted down by Liv, who succumbs to the poisonous berries. That leaves us with Teddy, the only character to truly follow the trail to the end. Does that make him the strongest? Not necessarily, but his last communication with the already dead Melissa sees him ask her to go home with Walter and move on without him, as though he's able to break away from his old life. Emerald City, here we come, and where does it lead us? Back to the very same vintage movie theater from the beginning. While most likely still in some sort of dimension, Teddy encounters the owner of the theater who was mentioned by Liv at the beginning, suggesting he is the wizard deity they've always been seeking. Perhaps he is the gatekeeper of escapism from the miserable world the town and Teddy look to get away from. In fact, when Teddy first obtains the documents, I believe the mysterious receptionist he speaks to is actually the same guy, particularly when he tells Teddy to enjoy the show, as though his fate has been determined this entire time. The owner tells Teddy the others have already arrived at their individual destinations, and now it's time for Teddy to come sit inside the purgatory of the movie theater, be numbed by the lights and sounds of the screen, and forget about reality. We get a glimpse of the spirits of the townsfolk surrounding Teddy, but what Teddy sees on the screen isn't sanctuary, but rather a hell within itself, as Melissa's corpse is hung like errands, declaring to a screaming, terrified Teddy that this is their home now. It's jarringly out of nowhere, but it insinuates some end-of-the-world type prophecy, which is even foreshadowed when Teddy first meets Liv in the same theater where she's watching a movie about said end of the world. It actually kind of ends like in The Mouth of Madness, where, assuming Teddy emerges like the sole survivor in 1940, the impression it leaves is that Teddy is now insane, knowing the end of the world is near, and something does in fact watch over us. But, like in the vein of most Lovecraftian narratives, our existence is powerless to do anything about it.